Have you ever wondered why some of the most extraordinary stories never make it into the history books? Welcome to 7 Continents, One Story.
So glad you're here with us today.
Yeah, this is literally my favorite place to be. Let's go.
I'm Celine, based in Edinburgh, Scotland. History hobbyist, library regular, endlessly curious.
I'm Niels, professor of history from Sweden. I've spent decades collecting these stories.
And I'm Ethan from Malta. I'm the one who always asks what happened in Japan.
Each episode, we travel together through time, across all 7 continents, to uncover a story that shaped the world.
We bring the history. Celine brings the questions that make you think differently about it.
And I bring the questions that make Niels slightly nervous.
The more we learn, the more we realize how much there still is to discover. Good evening, listeners. Welcome to another episode of 7 Continents, One Story. I'm Celine, and I'm joining you from Edinburgh today with a story about one of history's most devastating economic catastrophes. Before we dive in, I want to say this episode is special to us because it explores not just what happened, but how ordinary people survived something truly extraordinary. If you've ever wondered how an entire economy could collapse or how people rebuild after losing everything, well, you're about to find out. So stay with us as Niels, Ethan, and I take you back 97 years to explore the Great Depression, a moment when everything changed, and when one man's unsung heroism reminded us what we're capable of.
Right. I have something here that I think will fascinate both of you.
Is this another mystery artifact game? Because I'm definitely ready.
Even better, this is something I picked up, a replica of something, at the Smithsonian Institution during a research visit. And it's quite possibly the most historically destructive piece of paper I've ever held.
Destructive? How destructive are we talking?
It's a narrow roll of paper, about a ½ inch wide, but yards and yards long. It's covered in handwritten numbers, stock prices, some crossed out frantically, others written over again. The paper is yellowed with age, and there are coffee stains on it.
Wait, is this from the stock market crash?
This particular tape is from October 29th, 1929. The day the American stock market didn't just fall, it collapsed completely.
That's Black Tuesday.
Precisely. And what you're looking at is the moment when millions of Americans watched their life savings, their retirement, their children's education fund, their house down payment simply vanish, all in a single day. Let me take you there. The year is 1929. You're in New York City. The sun is rising over the East River on what should be an ordinary Tuesday morning. It's autumn. The leaves are turning gold and red in Central Park. But today is not ordinary. At the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street, hundreds of men in suits are gathering. They haven't slept. Their faces are white. Some are crying. Some are literally wringing their hands. And they all know that today will be catastrophic.
What happened?
Everything collapsed. And by the time the market closed that evening, 10 million lives would be forever changed. But first, let's understand how we got here.
So, Niels, I've been reading about this period, the 1920s. Everyone calls it the Roaring Twenties, right? Like it was this incredible time of prosperity?
Yes, and on the surface, it absolutely was. After World War I ended in 1918, America emerged as the most powerful nation on Earth. Factories were humming. New technologies were transforming daily life. Automobiles, radios, cinema. The stock market was soaring.
So people thought it would never stop? Like they thought the good times would just keep going forever?
Precisely, Ethan. There was this incredible optimism. People who had never invested in stocks before were putting their savings into the market. They were buying stocks on margin, which means they were only putting down a small percentage of the actual purchase price. Let me explain.
I don't know, but can I ask, what exactly does on margin mean?
Excellent question. Imagine you want to buy a house that costs $100,000. With margin buying, you only need to put down $10,000. The broker lends you the remaining $90,000. You hope the house value rises, so when you sell it, you make an enormous profit.
Oh, so if the house value goes up, you make a fortune. But if it goes down,
You lose everything you invested. Plus, you still owe the broker the money they lent you.
Oh my goodness. So when the market started falling,
Every price drop meant people owed more than their investments were worth, and brokers started demanding payment immediately. Now, while Wall Street was full of wealthy bankers and investors, there was a woman named Dorothea Lange who was about to play an absolutely crucial role in how America understood and survived what was coming.
who was she?
A photographer, born in 1905. By the late 1920s, she was making a living taking portraits in her photography studio in San Francisco.
A photographer? What does a photographer have to do with the stock market crash?
Everything, actually. But we'll come back to her. First, I want you to understand just how catastrophic the economic structure of this era really was.
I've been reading some fascinating, or rather depressing, historical analyses about this. The 1920s looked prosperous, but underneath.
Underneath, there were massive cracks. The American economy was built on a foundation of profound inequality. By 1929, the top 1% of Americans owned more wealth than the bottom 50% combined.
Wait, what? That's so unequal. Like, how does an economy even function like that?
It doesn't, not for long, because if most people don't have money to spend, factories can't sell their products, so production slows, workers get laid off, and suddenly the entire economy starts contracting.
And there was also the agricultural crisis, wasn't there?
Yes, while urban Americans were supposedly roaring, farmers were suffering. Agricultural prices had collapsed after World War I. Mechanization meant fewer farm workers were needed. There was a rural crisis happening simultaneously with urban prosperity.
So cities looked fine, but rural America was already struggling?
Exactly. And this matters because when the economy crashes, the people who are already struggling, farmers, rural workers, they have no safety net, no savings, no cushion. You know, before we go further, let me tell you more about this stock ticker tape I mentioned.
Yes, please. I want to know what makes it so significant.
Well, on October 28 and October 29, 1929, something extraordinary happened. The ticker machines literally could not keep up with the volume of stock sales. The machines broke down from exhaustion.
The machines broke down?
16 million shares were traded on Black Tuesday alone. The ticker machines couldn't print the prices fast enough. Brokers had to work through the entire night just trying to record what had been sold. By the time the prices were printed, they were already hours old. The stock ticker tape I'm holding, it represents that chaos, that overwhelming, unstoppable collapse.
And people were watching all this happen?
Yes, they were standing on Wall Street, watching the only wealth they had simply evaporate in real time.
So let's walk through exactly what happened. October 29th, 1929, the day called Black Tuesday.
Imagine you're a clerk at a brokerage office in Manhattan. It's early morning. The phones are already ringing. They don't stop ringing all day. Every call is someone screaming, "Sell! Sell everything! Please just sell before the prices drop further." And you start selling, but so is everyone else. On Wall Street, there are over 5,000 brokerage offices. Every single one is doing the same thing, selling, selling, selling.
But if everyone's selling and nobody's buying, what happens to the prices?
They collapse. By the end of the day on October 29th, industrial stocks had lost 30% of their value compared to just the day before. 30% gone in 24 hours.
My goodness! So someone who had $100,000 worth of stocks on Monday morning
Had maybe $70,000 by Tuesday evening. And by Wednesday, even less, because the panic continued.
Okay, but like, how many people actually lost money?
The estimate is approximately 25 million shares changed hands during the crash. But more importantly, consider the psychology. The crash didn't just affect Wall Street investors. It affected every bank in America.
because banks invested in stocks too?
Yes, and many of them had loaned depositors money to enable stock purchases. When the market crashed, those loans became worthless. Banks started failing. Within a few years, 25% of all American banks had completely failed.
A quarter of all the banks just failed? What happened to people's money in those banks?
It was gone. Depositors had no insurance. If your bank failed, your life savings vanished.
So someone who had never invested in stocks could lose everything just because their bank failed?
Precisely. That's how interconnected the economy was, and that's why this crisis spread like a contagion. It wasn't just stock market investors who suffered, it was everyone.
I was reading in the library the unemployment statistics are almost impossible to comprehend.
The numbers are staggering. In 1929, unemployment was about 3.2%. Within 4 years, by 1933, it had reached approximately 25%. 1 out of every 4 working Americans was unemployed.
1 out of 4? That's like in my school of 400 students, 100 of them would have no jobs.
That's exactly right. And remember, there's no welfare system back then, no unemployment insurance. If you're not working, you have no income, none.
So how did people eat?
Many of them didn't eat well, or they didn't eat at all. Charity organizations tried to help. Churches tried to help. Families moved in together to share resources. And there was starvation, real documented starvation in the world's richest country.
That's horrifying.
It is. But what's important to understand is that different groups suffered differently. African Americans faced even more brutal unemployment. Approximately 50% of black workers were out of work by 1933.
50%? Double the national average?
Because they faced discrimination. In a recession, employers would lay off black workers first. And because of segregation, black workers couldn't access many jobs available to white workers.
I want to ask about something I heard called Hoovervilles. What were those?
Ethan. Hoovervilles were one of the most visible symbols of the Depression. They were shantytowns, settlements of makeshift homes built from scrap metal, cardboard, wood, whatever people could find.
And they were named after President Hoover?
Yes, because many Americans blamed him for not doing enough to prevent the crisis. Hoovervilles started appearing in 1930, within months of the crash. By 1932, you could find them in major cities across America.
How many people lived in these settlements?
Thousands. In some cities, tens of thousands. You'd have these sprawling camps with hundreds of makeshift dwellings, families with children living in structures made of cardboard and scrap wood. No running water, no electricity, no sanitation.
And the government did nothing?
President Hoover believed that direct government aid would weaken people's character. He preferred voluntary cooperation between private businesses and individuals. He thought Americans should help themselves.
But how can people help themselves when there are literally no jobs?
Exactly. That's why his approach failed so catastrophically. By the time Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected in 1932, Hoover's popularity had completely collapsed.
And while the economic crisis was devastating, there was also an environmental catastrophe happening simultaneously, correct?
Yes, the Dust Bowl. This was a crisis layered on top of an already catastrophic economic depression, and it's one of the most heartbreaking dimensions of this entire era. Beginning around 1930, a severe drought began affecting the Great Plains, Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, New Mexico, and the surrounding regions. The soil, which had been overfarmed for decades, had lost its ability to hold together. Without sufficient rain and with topsoil depleted, the earth literally blew away.
The earth blew away? Like, how is that possible?
Imagine standing outside and looking at the horizon. Then imagine a wall of dust rushing toward you. Not a dust cloud, a wall. 40,000 feet high, black as night, arriving without warning, swallowing entire towns.
That sounds apocalyptic.
It was. Farmers woke up in the morning to find their fields destroyed, their cattle starved, their livelihood completely eliminated. Hundreds of thousands of people from the drought regions had to flee. They packed whatever they could and headed west to California, hoping to find work.
But if there's no work in the East because of the Depression...
There was certainly no work in California either. Those Dust Bowl refugees arrived expecting opportunity and found only more poverty. The Depression didn't welcome them. Established residents often resented them, seeing them as competition for scarce jobs.
How many people fled?
Estimates suggest between 250,000 and 300,000 people left the Great Plains during the Dust Bowl years. Imagine hundreds of thousands of people losing everything. Twice.
I've been reading about how this crisis spread beyond America. Is that true?
Absolutely. This is a crucial point. The Great Depression wasn't an American crisis. It became a global catastrophe. World trade collapsed by approximately 50 to 70%.
50 to 70%? That's massive.
Well, remember, America was the world's largest economy and creditor nation. When Americans stopped buying foreign products, economies everywhere collapsed. Britain struggled tremendously. Germany's economy, which had been fragile since the reparations from World War I, completely disintegrated.
And that had serious political consequences, didn't it?
Yes, Germany's economic desperation created a vacuum that Adolf Hitler filled. The Nazi movement gained support because Germans were desperate for someone to promise economic recovery. The Great Depression didn't directly cause World War II, but the economic conditions it created certainly enabled the rise of fascism.
So, like, millions of people died in World War II because of the economic chaos from the stock market crash?
It's complicated, but there's a direct line from October 29, 1929 to 1939. Economics and history are inextricably linked. Now, let me complete the mystery of this stock ticker tape I mentioned earlier.
Yes, please. What's the final clue?
The most important detail, this particular piece of tape, the replica I have, it comes from the collection at the Smithsonian Institution, but there's something extraordinary about it. This tape was sent to President Hoover after the crash. He kept it in his personal collection as a reminder.
As a reminder of what?
As a reminder of the moment he failed to act. As a reminder of the millions of lives he didn't save. As a reminder that the choices leaders make, or refuse to make, have consequences that echo through generations.
So this artifact isn't just about the crash itself.
No, it's about responsibility. It's about a president who believed the market would self-correct, that voluntary cooperation would be enough, that people should help themselves, and it's about what happened when that philosophy met reality. 25% unemployment, starvation, homelessness, desperation.
All recorded on this piece of paper.
On this piece of paper. Which is why I believe every economist, every leader, every person interested in how to structure an economy, they should hold a stock ticker tape from the Great Depression. They should feel the weight of those numbers, because those numbers represent human lives.
So here's the crucial question in all of this. President Hoover was facing an unprecedented crisis. Nobody in American government had ever experienced anything like this before. What should he do?
Exactly, and this becomes a choose-your-own-history moment. Picture yourself as President Hoover in November 1929, a month after the crash. You're receiving reports that are absolutely catastrophic. Your advisors are telling you unemployment is rising, banks are failing, the stock market keeps falling. What do? Do you, option 1, use government resources to stabilize the economy, lend money to banks to prevent failures, create government jobs programs to put people to work. Option 2, maintain a laissez-faire approach. Let the market correct itself naturally. Avoid direct government intervention because it might weaken the economy's strength. Option 3, some combination. Moderate government action, but not too much. Help, but not too much help.
Okay, I don't even need to think about this. You have to help people. People are literally starving. You do option 1, obviously.
I understand why you'd say that, Ethan, but let me play devil's advocate. The government is already spending money from the Treasury. If you spend more on relief programs, you'll go into deficit spending. You'll have to borrow money. Some economists actually argued that that would make things worse.
Celine makes an important point. The economic theory at the time was actually against government spending. Most economists believed that in a recession, you should cut government spending. Balance the budget.
But that makes the problem worse, doesn't it? If you cut spending when people have no money.
You're right, but economists at the time didn't understand that. They believed in a different theory. So Hoover he did believe he was helping.
He did something, but not enough. He created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to lend money to banks and businesses. But he believed this money should help businesses, not go directly to relief for unemployed people.
But why? Why not help the people?
Because Hoover believed that direct relief would undermine American self-reliance. He thought Americans would become dependent on government aid.
I think in Hoover's position, I might have been cautious too. He was operating with the economic knowledge available at the time. He was trying to prevent what he saw as moral hazard, people becoming dependent on government.
But that doesn't match reality. People didn't want charity. They wanted jobs. There's a difference.
Ethan's exactly right, and that's the tragedy of this moment. Hoover's belief system prevented him from seeing what was actually happening. He was fighting the Depression with 19th century economic theories. He refused to admit that something unprecedented was occurring.
which is why his popularity collapsed. By 1932, Americans were furious. They felt abandoned.
And that fury led to one of the most transformative political shifts in American history. In 1932, Americans voted Hoover out of office. They elected a man named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, a man who believed the government had a responsibility to act.
And did he actually help?
When FDR took office in March 1933, unemployment was still at 25%. The banking system was on the verge of complete collapse. But he did something extraordinary. He acted immediately. He created the Works Progress Administration to employ millions of people, the Tennessee Valley Authority to bring electricity to rural areas, the Social Security Administration to provide a safety net for elderly people, unemployed people, and people with disabilities.
So he basically created what we now know as the social safety net?
He fundamentally transformed the relationship between Americans and their government. Before FDR, the government was supposed to stay out of people's lives. After FDR, the government had a responsibility for people's welfare.
And did this fix the Depression?
That's where historians debate. Some say FDR's programs were crucial. Others argue that what really ended the Depression was the massive government spending that came with World War II. But what's indisputable is this: Americans felt hope again.
Wait, earlier you mentioned a photographer named Dorothea Lange. How does she fit into all this?
This is where I want to return to her, because her role was absolutely crucial. Remember, I said she was a portrait photographer in San Francisco in the late 1920s? When the Depression hit, Dorothea Lange saw the suffering around her, and she realized something crucial. Nobody was documenting it. The government wasn't showing people what was actually happening. The news was sanitized. People in the wealthy areas had no idea what was going on in the poor areas.
So she decided to photograph it?
She decided to document the human cost of the Depression. She got a camera and traveled throughout California, photographing unemployed workers, migrant farm families, people in breadlines, mothers holding starving children.
And those photographs, they changed things?
They changed everything. In 1935, the government hired her to photograph rural poverty. She created some of the most iconic images of the entire 20th century. Images so powerful that when Americans saw them, they finally understood. They couldn't deny the suffering anymore. One photograph in particular, Migrant Mother, shows a woman in a migrant camp with her children. The woman is thin, exhausted, desperate. The children cling to her. It became the defining image of the Great Depression.
So she basically forced America to face reality?
Yes. She used her camera as a weapon of truth, and that truth was essential for building political support for FDR's relief programs. Without Dorothea Lange's photographs, Americans might not have supported the New Deal. The Depression might have lasted even longer.
So she was an unsung hero because her work literally saved lives, but most people don't know her name?
Exactly. History tends to focus on the politicians and the economists, but Dorothea Lange, she was the one who made America feel the human cost. Remember her name, Dorothea Lange? Remember the name.
So what happened after? Did people recover?
The recovery was slow. Unemployment didn't return to 1920s levels until World War II. But the Depression created permanent changes. It destroyed Americans' faith in purely unregulated markets. It created the social safety net. Social Security still exists today, more than 90 years later. It taught governments that they have a responsibility to manage their economies and protect their citizens.
And it showed just how quickly prosperity can disappear. I mean, 1929 looked like it would boom forever, then boom, it's gone.
Which is why we still study the Great Depression today. It's the template for understanding economic crises.
So have there been financial crises since then?
Yes. In 1989, there was the savings and loan crisis. In 1998, there was a financial crisis. But the most relevant one is the 2008 financial crisis.
Oh, yes, I was reading about that. The housing crisis?
Right. In 2008, the U.S. housing market collapsed. Banks failed. Millions of people lost their homes. Unemployment spiked. It was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. But here's the crucial difference. Because of what was learned from the 1930s, governments acted immediately. The Federal Reserve provided emergency lending. Congress passed a stimulus package. President Obama's administration used government spending to prevent complete economic collapse.
So because they learned from the Great Depression, they prevented an even worse crisis?
Exactly. Historians and economists generally agree that without aggressive government intervention in 2008, we would have experienced something even worse than the Great Depression.
So the Depression's lesson was the government needs to act quickly and decisively?
And that market forces alone won't solve a systemic crisis. Sometimes you need government intervention to prevent complete collapse.
You mentioned earlier that this was global. How are economies connected like that?
Trade is the primary connection. When America's economy is strong, Americans buy products from around the world. Other countries' factories run at full capacity. Workers everywhere have jobs. But when America's economy collapsed in 1929, Americans stopped buying. They couldn't afford to. So factories in Britain shut down. Factories in Germany shut down. Factories in Japan shut down. Unemployment spread globally.
So an economic collapse in one country can ripple through the entire world.
In our modern, interconnected world, absolutely. A financial crisis in one country quickly becomes a global crisis. That's why economists monitor global economic indicators so carefully. They're looking for signs of potential contagion.
That's actually kind of terrifying.
It is, which is why international cooperation in economic matters is so crucial.
You know what I found fascinating when I was reading about this? There are so many details that people don't know about.
Such as?
Well, for instance, there was mass starvation in America. In 1933, the American Medical Association documented cases of death from starvation, not malnutrition, but actual starvation, in the wealthiest country on earth.
But America is supposed to be wealthy. How can people starve?
Because wealth alone doesn't guarantee that everyone eats. If the economic systems collapse in a way that prevents food distribution, people starve. It's happened throughout history. It happened here. Here's another surprising detail, and this relates to Dorothea Lange's work. When she photographed migrant farm workers, they were picking the most abundant harvest in America's history. There was more food than ever before, but migrant workers were starving because they couldn't afford to buy the food they were picking.
They were picking food they couldn't eat?
Yes, the economic system was broken in such a fundamental way that abundance didn't help the poorest people.
That seems almost impossible. How does that happen?
Because there was a disconnect between supply and demand. There was food, but people had no money. Food prices were kept artificially high by agricultural policies designed to help farmers. So while there was physically enough food, economically, the poorest people couldn't access it.
Which is why Dorothea Lange's photographs were so important. They showed this contradiction: food everywhere, but children starving.
So did every country respond the same way as America? Like, did other countries do New Deal programs?
Interestingly, no. Different countries tried different approaches. In Britain, they maintained a more conventional economic approach. In Germany, Hitler's Nazi government used massive public works programs, but for military purposes. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's government, well, that's a different story entirely.
What about Japan?
Excellent question, Ethan. Japan's response is particularly interesting because it shows how military priorities shaped economic policy. Japan's economy was devastated by the Great Depression. But rather than spending on domestic relief like America, Japan invested in military expansion. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. This military spending drove the Japanese economy.
So Japan recovered from the Depression by starting wars?
In the short term, yes. Military spending employed workers and stimulated the economy, but it created a military-industrial complex that ultimately led Japan to World War II. So the economic choices of the 1930s had military consequences in the 1940s.
So different countries made different choices, but they all led to, well, to World War II eventually.
One could argue that the Great Depression created the conditions for World War II. The economic desperation in Germany and Japan led to military aggression. The willingness of democracies like Britain and France to appease aggression was partly motivated by economic considerations.
So the stock market crash in 1929 led to millions of deaths in World War II?
There's a direct line from October the 29th, 1929 to 1939. Economics and history are inextricably linked.
But I also want to emphasize something positive. Despite all this devastation, people survived. They built community. They supported each other.
Absolutely. That's one of the most inspiring aspects of Depression history. Yes, there was starvation and desperation, But there was also extraordinary human kindness. Families doubled and tripled up in small houses to save on rent. Communities organized soup kitchens. Churches provided shelter. Neighbors helped neighbors. People created art, music, and culture despite their circumstances.
So, like, even in terrible situations, people find ways to help each other.
Always. That's the most resilient aspect of humanity. In the face of catastrophe, people find ways to create community and meaning.
And that's also how recovery happens, not through government programs alone, but through the combination of government action and community resilience.
So what do we learn from the Great Depression? What are the lessons?
Maybe that the economy isn't separate from regular people's lives, like what happens on Wall Street affects real people.
That's an excellent insight, Ethan. Yes, the economy is fundamentally about human lives. Every economic decision has real consequences for real people. Another lesson, markets can fail. They're not always self-correcting. Sometimes you need government intervention, but too much regulation can also stifle growth. It's a balance.
And interconnection is real. Every economy is connected to every other economy. What happens globally affects everyone locally.
And individual heroism matters. Dorothea Lange didn't have political power, she didn't have wealth, but she had a camera and determination. And that changed history.
So, like, normal people can actually change things?
Absolutely. History isn't just made by presidents and generals. It's made by people who see injustice and decide to document it. People who see suffering and decide to act.
We've covered a lot today. The stock market crashed, millions lost their jobs, people starved. But governments learned. They acted differently when the next crisis came. And people like Dorothea Lange reminded us that behind every statistic is a human story. The Great Depression lasted about 10 years, but its lessons have lasted nearly a century, and they're still relevant today whenever we hear about economic crises or talk about whether government should help people in need. What strikes me most about this episode is that Dorothea Lange, the photographer nobody remembers, she probably made a bigger difference than most of the politicians of her era. She saw suffering, she documented it, and she made people care. That's powerful. Remember the name, Dorothea Lange. Remember her work. And remember that in the face of economic catastrophe, human creativity and compassion can still shine through. And remember what Niels always says, until our next journey through time, keep history alive. Thank you for joining us on this episode of 7 Continents, One Story. Next week, we're staying in North America, but we're jumping forward to 1945, a country emerging from war with unprecedented economic power, a decision that will reshape the global economy, the Bretton Woods Conference. You don't want to miss it.